Hi, everyone. Welcome to How to Write the Future podcast. I'm your host, Beth Barany. I am an award-winning science fiction and fantasy writer, also creativity coach, writing teacher, and editor, and also filmmaker, and of course, podcaster. And I believe that with our creativity and our imagination and our diligence, we can create stories that actually can remake the world. And I love interviewing people for my podcast, thinkers, creatives, futurists, forward thinkers. And today I'm so excited to bring to you a special guest, Surekha Davies. Surekha, can you please introduce yourself for us, and then we'll dive into questions.
Hello, everyone. Very happy to be here. I'm a historian of science, art, and ideas. I'm also a bit of a monster consultant for radio, TV, that kind of thing. And I became a historian of exploration and broadened that out into thinking about monsters through time for the book that's just come out, Humans: A Monstrous History, which is a history of humanity from antiquity to the present. And yes, it has a very cool mirror on it.
Maybe you can tell us, like, what brought you into studying monsters, because I immediately gravitated toward it as a storyteller. I have a whole story series I want to build around monsters, a TV show actually, with my heroine Henrietta the Dragon Slayer and the monsters. And I see a lot of women writers also really going deep into the monsters, and there's this whole thing evolving, and it's fascinating. So yeah, if you could tell us a little bit about your evolution and what brought you to this topic.
It all started with too much Star Trek, although you could say that that's a lie because there is never too much Star Trek. As a small child, was just watching Star Trek Next Generation and Cosmos and Deep Space Nine as soon as it came out. And all I wanted to do was be an intergalactic explorer because, like, what better thing could you possibly want to do than to be Jean-Luc Picard? And so my original major when I started university was theoretical physics, but too much Star Trek. By the end of the first year, I realized, once I'd taken a quantum mechanics class, that there wasn't going to be warp drive in my own lifetime. So why was I doing this? It had all been about being in this space of wonder when faced with beings who were incomprehensible and exciting. I won't even go camping. I swapped to history and philosophy of science, which was a very easy swap at Cambridge, where I was an undergrad. And I found myself working on the history of exploration. And that took me to the 16th century, to a moment that was, in a very small way, one of those meeting aliens, on both sides of the encounter, in that the two hemispheres had been mostly separate for as long as humans have been around. And so I studied those encounters between Europeans and indigenous peoples. And one of the things I noticed was that there were illustrations on maps. And, I became a curator at the British Library while I was trying to figure out what to do my PhD on. And an exhibition that I curated when, there was a gap in the calendar and somebody needed to be thrown in to do it, was on 16th century maps with images of monsters, simply because I ran into the reading room, opened all the reference books in haste because I had to come up with a topic by the end of the week. So I looked at the 16th century stuff and thought, wait a minute, there are monsters on these maps. And so that was at the back of my mind. And then I wrote my first book on images of peoples of the Americas in 16th century maps, and how the category of the human changed in the Renaissance as people tried to figure out who or what was over there. Because, ancient knowledge had predicted that in distant places with very, very different climates, humans would basically be monstrous. And so I got into the monsters when I noticed that so much of the visual material about the Americas, about peoples in those early centuries, early decades, were either, headless men or giants or eaters of human flesh. And these ideas were bound up with maps because, the way of thinking about the body then was that it was malleable. We weren't these fixed beings, but we were vulnerable, if you will, to the climate. And ancient Greek naturalists, Roman naturalists, had talked about monstrous peoples at the edges of the world where the climate was harsh. And so once you're actually traveling everywhere, you've got to ask, where's the boundary between human space and monster space? Once you start putting people on maps in different places, that makes differences of people with latitude very visible and comparable. So I got into monsters because I saw them, and then I realized that, the very idea of human is bound up with ideas about monsters, because where's the limit to human in terms of the kind of body, the kind of behavior? Where does human end and animal begin? Where does human end and God begin? And I realized there was a history to how people have thought about those boundaries between human and animal, God, machine, extraterrestrial, and that boundary is always moving. And who sits on that boundary? They're the category disruptors. They're the category problems. And if you call them monsters, you can have your tidy categories on either side. Your animals, your humans, your machines. So long as you have a word for human crossed with machine, and that word is cyborg. So the cyborg then is effectively a monster. So it started with Star Trek, and it's come right back around to Star Trek again.
Wow, I love that. I have to admit to all that are listening, I too am a huge, huge Trekkie, and it deeply influences my science fiction and probably all of my storytelling. So let's move into fiction, because our main audience here is science fiction and fantasy writers primarily, but and anyone who cares about the future, and anyone who, I mean, I invite all listeners to explore their creativity. What would you say makes a good monster for fiction writers? And maybe we could stick to science fiction and fantasy, since that's the genre that I know the best. And as an avid Star Trekker, you know it quite well as well. So yeah, thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So what makes, a good monster in science fiction, in fantasy? I'd say, maybe, I want to start with I have to start with a Star Trek example. And so I'd say look no further than the Borg Collective when they first appear in Star Trek Next Generation. So for anyone who's not a Trekkie, the summary is the Borg are cyborgs. They're vaguely human shaped, partially organic, partially machine, but their organic bodies are made up of all the species they have assimilated. So they assimilate people and absorb their uniqueness into the Borg. And maybe the key element that makes the Borg terrifying and monstrous is that they trouble the boundary not just between human and machine, like all cyborgs, because they go around assimilating species. You, the viewer, the characters on the show, they aren't safe either. That is maybe a fundamental thing that fictional monsters that are very powerful, and also narratives in the present about monster making share, which is creating this sense of an existential threat posed by this being. They're not just a villain. They pose a threat to the integrity of your body, not just because they might shoot you with bullets and you might die, but because you might no longer be the same once you've spent time in their presence. So they might disrupt your body. They also have disrupted how you think about the life that exists on Earth. So, oh my goodness, there's this species that goes on absorbing other species. And, they've got this deathly pallor. So, of course, the other extreme is just the visceral effect of how they look. And there's, so much care has gone into this, as, of course, with Star Trek and all of their aliens. When a person becomes turned into a Borg, they have things injected into them, nanoprobes, tiny robots, and their skin color changes. And maybe one of the things that's kind of maybe powerful today is we also kind of think about how otherness is framed through what skin looks like, even when everything else is kind of the same. They have prosthetics that have special tools stuck on them. And to go again from the very physical to the mental, they have something of a hive mind. And that, again, is really terrifying because not only do we now fear the integrity of our body in case we're assimilated, but our minds won't be private either. Because all the drones, as they're called, can hear one another. I could go on for forever there, but I'll stop for the moment and say there's a perfection that comes with really activating all the ways in which a monster might destabilize the viewer. And what the Borg story does is it draws on the way we already think about what's normal and what's not, but also draws on what we already know about the Star Trek universe and what their other foes and rivals look like. Even from when you look at the ships, the Klingons have ships called birds of prey, and they are elegant and bird-like. And the Romulans, who are kind of the enemies, their ships are kind of green, so that's spookier and snake-like. But the Borg have got cubes. So it's like, oh my God, when has the ship ever not been round? So even within the universe of Star Trek and its imaginary ships, they found a way to make them, really uncanny.
Yeah, very unusual, confounding. Yeah. I love that you use the Borg as a great example of a terrifying monster inside of the Star Trek universe.
It's something I've learned, a way in which I've maybe kind of changed a little bit in the process of writing this book is that I don't call people monsters, even in my head. It's like, it's, of course, one shouldn't call people things anyway, but, I don't, that isn't a category I use on sociopaths or mass murderers or anyone for a couple of reasons. One, I don't want to dignify, for example, tech billionaire losers with a word like monster. That just makes them too important, frankly. It's too easy to label someone like, I don't know, a school shooter and say, oh gosh, they're a monster. And it somehow absolves the rest of society from wondering whether anybody else in that society might become a school shooter or murder people. And it gets in the way of addressing systemic problems like radicalization of young people, wholesale misogyny, the kind of rise of the acceptability of using violence. And so I've now half forgotten your question. Oh, yes. Well, what does it mean if people call others monsters? Yeah, I think it's, for me, that word as a tool to use has kind of lost its power because it gets in the way of recognizing all the things that need to be done to change and stop those kinds of actions happening. And it's too easy to then panic because someone has terrified you because they're a monster. So don't give them the power that the Borg have, because then you can't function. You can't resist them. You can't make jokes. You can't poke fun of the dictator if you give them too much power. But a lot of my book is about something I call monsterification or monster making, which is telling stories about individuals or groups in such a way as to frame them as falling outside of the category of human. So, and this is where when stories are told about how, for example, all Latin American immigrants are allegedly serious criminals. I mean, those are stories of monsterification, which are used to justify, for example, kidnapping people off the streets and trafficking them to gulags overseas without due process. Actual US citizens have had this happen to them. They're calling people monsters. And I guess to go back to the start of your question, which is how am I defining monster? I define the word very broadly and very, very generally to simply mean category disruptor. So everybody has, so we say, a taxonomy of like stuff there is in the world. There are apes and cats and dogs and lions and so on, and machines and robots. And if we have a finite set of categories of things in the world. And so what that means is if you run across something that transcends a couple of them, that straddles a couple of them, that is kind of technically a monster. That doesn't mean you have to run around and have a nervous breakdown. It just means you've come across something that isn't from, your categories. And so, as you look at the kind of history history of taxonomy, if you will, you can see that there have been a lot of examples of fictional or religious or actual physical in the world beings who have crossed either the boundary between human and some other kind of category altogether, like machine or God, or they've crossed and challenged social categories between men and women, between faiths, between different nations, of course, and the invention of race. And the third kind of so-called category breakers are the individuals and groups who societies use to define the parameters of normal for an individual human body. So what are quote unquote normal heights to be? What are normal things that someone can do? And so the kind of language of ability and disability is one with which societies decide what the parameters of normal. So monster making isn't simply about, say, ethnic and racial monsterification and discrimination. Monsters can also be perfectly neutral. I'm not sure we would call werewolf neutral exactly, but it's not always real things in the political world. But there are also very positive monsters, and the Muppet Show is a place where one can see modeled a different way of engaging with complete variety and hybridity.
Also, the movie Monsters, Inc.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, that is such a favorite movie of mine. It came out just as I was beginning my PhD. And that's another place where you can see absolutely, I think, fantastic monsters. And there are three quite different kinds of monsters in there. There are the classic children's bedtime horror story monsters, the big blue hairy animal, and, the giant single-eyed funny round guy. So they're the heroes, Mike and Sully. And then there is another kind of classic monster, which is kind of Randall, the arch villain, who is reptilian. And that is, again, really activating an ancient kind of human fear. Reptiles are kind of creepy. And he has a great many, limbs. He can turn invisible. So he's uncanny. But I think the top monster in there is the small child, the toddler, Boo. Because when you enter Monstropolis, through a child's closet door, for example, it's like going through the mirror, going through the looking glass. Because in Monstropolis, everyone is who we would think of as a monster. And they just go about their lives, and it looks like New York City. And for them, human children are terrifying, dangerous, toxic beings who live on the other side of these doors. But Monstrop runs on the power of their screams. And so what makes Boo, the little 2-year-old kid, an amazing monster is because the way she looks and acts, on one level, she's the opposite of a monster. Is she the target? I mean, she's 2, she's got pigtails, she's only got one sock and no shoes, she's dressed in pink. I mean, isn't this the ultimate, like, monster fodder? But no, I mean, people, like, run screaming from her because, one, they think, the mythology, the monsterification mythology, they think all human children are toxic and they'll die if they touch her. But she herself, she enters this world where everybody looks like the monsters for a 2-year-old. They're all kind of terrifying. And all she sees is things of joy and wonder. She calls one of the scariest monsters Kitty, because he's just a giant cat to her. And so she models a different way of looking at different and surprising beings, um, while at the same time kind of showing us how, when we monstrify others, how wrong we might be.
I love that. Thank you so much for that fabulous summary and analysis of that movie, which is also dearly beloved in our house. Uh, and this also comes to this fabulous idea of the ethics of thinking about monsters and how we tell stories about them. Are we going to be like Boo and be amazed? Another character in fiction who is amazed by monsters is Doctor Who. At every encounter, Doctor Who is like, hello, I have never seen one like you before. Wow. Even though the monster's like, ah, I want to eat you. And Doctor Who is in whatever form they are in, they're like, wow. And that brave wonder and curiosity toward monsters, or, the terror, the vilification, the just blanket assumptions, and I'm wondering if there's more nuances here around the ethics, because I feel like humanity is and I want to call it an evolution, one of learning that difference is interesting and wondrous versus horrifying, and it's going to eat us and destroy our sense of everything we hold dear. So I really feel like humanity is on that cusp, and maybe has been since, the 1500s, when our the Westerners were sailing out beyond their boundaries. I should say
Mm.
Europeans, because there are other cultures that also sailed beyond their boundaries. The Pacific Islanders also sailed beyond their boundaries. The Chinese did as well. But those aren't the dominant stories these days. Anyway, yeah, if you could speak to the ethics a bit of how we go about making monsters of others, that would be
Mhm.
very interesting.
On the one hand, I mean, maybe, a lot of people read fiction for fun, then and not to have people hectoring them about how not to monstrify. So we can start by saying, kind of the books in every genre have, there's the whole constellation of moments and in people's lives when they read them, and like different reasons they may be reading a book at a particular time. That said, whatever we write, fiction or nonfiction, and put out into the world, it's going out at a moment in a context which people are going to interact with it in that place and time. I mean, who knows in 50 years how people will interact, but we don't care about that. Not yet, anyway. Even if you are writing something that you see as, a light beach read, I mean, we all think about our audiences because we want our books to connect with them. We want people to want to read them, to love them, to tell other people about them. So we are thinking about how the books are going to land. And I guess when it comes to fashioning kind of heroes and villains and characters and monsters, it's worth kind of remembering that the characteristics we give them also, to make sure the biases and preconceptions of the present, that we don't simply go and replicate them without thinking. But there's so much potential to model hopeful ways for the future to be, and it doesn't even have to be because you've envisioned a utopian future like Star Trek. It can also be more set in the present, like something like Spider-Man. And I think I'm going to call him Jerry Maguire, and that is, of course, not his name. The Spider-Man who played with James Franco.
All right.
Tobey Maguire.
Tobey Maguire, that's
And
right.
it was Maguire, wasn't it? I was not completely coming out of, another dimension. I mean, it's a great job as Spider-Man, and of course, it's that wonderful kind of comic book hyper reality. It's kind of our world, and then you have all these like extraordinary characters with superpowers. I mean, but Spider-Man is the protagonist. Yet he's bullied in school in this really mundane school playground kind of monstrification, that kind of low level teasing, but it is about alienating someone and creating a kind of threatening environment for them because he is kind of physically harassed as well. It's very low level, but it's something that everybody has kind of seen in their lives. So there's a possibility with fiction to engender empathy in different kinds of people. And the more incredible and amazing and great your story, the more that's going to stay with people. And I think the TV series Gotham is extraordinary for how it shows you how people became some of the villains that crop up later in, all kinds of movie franchises. So it's sort of a prequel of before Batman was grown up. And as you go through the series, various characters, some of them start out as good guys and the others are bad guys. And then like things happen to them along the way. And it really unsettles that boundary between good and bad in ways that I think help people think about how not to, how to fix, sectarian violence. I'm kind of maybe exaggerating, but
Well, it's about, like you were saying, having empathy and recognizing that the people we might want to label as monsters, well, they're people and things and circumstances and choices. And, you
yeah,
watch a lot of cop shows and they're always saying, like, you never know who might be violent in a certain situation. We can't predict how we might behave.
yeah, yeah, and I guess the other kind of dimension of the ethics is today it's usually not that each one of us is running around, monstrifying other people, but people with power and influence and platforms monstrify entire groups, and so it behooves us to recognize when we notice this happening, when stories are told about how entire groups of people who, and it's always the same, it's always some kind of group that's always been marginalized, women, people who don't fit, who are not gender conforming, immigrants. A century ago it was Irish immigrants and Jewish immigrants. And so that's one of the ways in which these monstrifying stories in the real world have power, is because they attach themselves to earlier, prejudices and reactivate them. So I think something that, I mean, an ethical possibility with storytelling is to make people more attuned to seeing that. Maybe that's also a future of storytelling, to more kind of explicitly show monstrification in action and, show that people have a choice, and, they can notice how their fears of, legitimate fears of, say, financial security might be actually co-opted, so that they're not actually paying attention to why they might be financially insecure, which is that income inequality is growing and there are far too many billionaires.
Yeah. Well, I feel like you and I could keep going as we have in the past when we first met and we talked for
We
hours.
have, yeah.
Yeah. So I want to ask you one last question that I like to ask people off the cuff before we wrap up, which is, when you hear how to write the future, that phrase, what does that evoke for you?
It sounds hopeful. It's like, oh, something I can do. The future isn't written in stone, which I love.
Oh, I love that. I love that so much. Well, thank you so much, Surekha, for being a guest. Surekha, I really appreciate it. I hope we get a chance to talk again. And I just want to say to everybody that is listening, write long and prosper.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.